Welcome to Podkey Fantasy Football, where the NFC North hype gets a proper stress test. A lot of fantasy takes sound clean until you ask what has to be true for them to work. The Bears have upside with more fragility than people admit. The Lions have about as friendly a runway as you can ask for, and the Vikings might hand us a quarterback lottery ticket with real consequences. Chicago is one of those teams where the fantasy argument and the real-life team argument keep colliding. Caleb Williams still offers the kind of athleticism that can rescue a fantasy week, but the passing profile was wildly unstable. A 58% completion rate was the lowest among qualified quarterbacks, and he finished dead last in off-target rate. That matters because fantasy managers tend to remember the splash plays and forget the single-digit weeks. If accuracy is that volatile, every pass catcher inherits that volatility. The easy counter is second-year growth, better chemistry, normal development. That's plausible, but it is still a projection, not a fact. What we know is the baseline was boom or bust. Colson Loveland is where this gets interesting. During the playoff run, he had a 28% target share, and 42% of his points came in the fourth quarter. You can read that two ways. The optimistic read is that he became a trusted late-game option. The cautious read is that his value may be tied to catch-up scripts and end-game volume, which is useful for fantasy but not always sticky week to week. At a fourth-round price, that kind of contingent upside is very real. The key is understanding you're probably buying game state dependency, not necessarily a stable every-drive role. Then there's the receiver debate, which is really a debate about what kind of evidence you trust. Luther Burden has supporters because the route efficiency looked sharp, but that case leans heavily on a small sample. Rome Odunze has the stronger traditional breakout case because he looked like the alpha early, with roughly a 25% market share before the foot injury. After that, the usage faded. So the contradiction is simple. Burden's case is fresher, Rome's case is sturdier. If you want ceiling at cost, Burden makes sense. If you want the better supported talent and role thesis, Rome still has the cleaner argument, assuming health. Green Bay is almost the opposite story. The quarterback evidence is stronger than the fantasy discourse sometimes suggests. Jordan Love ranked first in EPA with a clean pocket and sixth in passer rating among quarterbacks with at least 200 dropbacks. That's not proof he's elite, but it is strong evidence that the underlying play is solid. For fantasy, that usually means the floor is safer than people think, even if the week-to-week distribution stays spread out, because the receiving hierarchy is unsettled. Josh Jacobs is the harder evaluation. He is still the primary red zone scorer, which keeps his fantasy value intact, even if the efficiency wobbles. But there are multiple layers of risk here. He's 28.5, the workload has mileage on it, there's lingering suspension risk chatter tied to allegations that were later downplayed, and Marshawn Lloyd is the kind of emerging back who can siphon enough work to matter without taking over the backfield outright. That's an important distinction. Jacobs doesn't need to lose the job to disappoint at cost. He just needs a little less volume, a little less touchdown luck, and a little more missed time. The pass-catching group raises the same kind of issue. Christian Watson's talent is obvious, but injury history forces you to price in fragility. Jaden Reed and Matthew Golden both look like players who can win you a week and then disappear from the target tree the next one. And Tucker Kraft's ACL tear changes the shape of the offense early before the injury. The projection was enormous. Now the return pushes into the early season. And even when players get back, role and explosiveness don't always come back immediately. So the clean takeaway is that Love looks like the steadiest asset here, while the supporting cast is full of range of outcome bets. Detroit has the friendliest team-level environment of the bunch, and this is one case where the optimism is actually well supported. The 2025 schedule rates as the easiest in the league, and the Lions are favored in 14 of their first 15 games. That is a massive structural advantage for wins, efficiency, and fantasy consistency. Schedule strength can be noisy, so it shouldn't be treated like destiny, but when the gap is this large, it does change the burden of proof. If you're projecting Detroit down, you need a stronger reason than vague regression talk. The broader context helps too. The defense is expected to improve despite injury concerns, and if that happens, the offense gets more drives in favorable game states and more chances to stay efficient instead of chasing chaos. Jameson Williams is still the classic high-variance fantasy pick. He can tilt a week, and he can also vanish. The note that his production spikes when Sam Laporta is injured is useful, but we should be careful with the conclusion. That could be scheme, it could be target redistribution, or it could just be a small sample catching a few spike weeks. The correlation is real, the cause is still unclear. That makes Jameson attractive in the middle rounds if your roster can absorb volatility, but shaky if you need stable weekly target volume. At running back, DeAndre Swift still profiles as the premium receiving option, and that role tends to age well in fantasy because catches smooth out weekly scoring. Kyle Monunge becomes relevant because of what he showed in Swift's Week 9 absence, handling a 31-play workload that looked legitimately bell cow capable. That does not mean he's a threat to outproduce Swift when both are healthy. It does mean he is the kind of cheap contingency pick that becomes very valuable the moment the starter misses time. The Vikings situation is pure variance. If the preseason battle really is Kyler Murray versus J.J. McCarthy, fantasy managers need to separate talent profile from role certainty. Murray is the obvious fantasy swing because the rushing is bankable. When he's on the field, he ranked top 4 in rushing yards per game among starting quarterbacks, and that kind of production can drag a passer into the top 10 even without perfect efficiency. So if he wins the job, the late-round sleeper case is easy to understand. The problem is that all of it depends on a coaching decision we do not control, and quarterback competitions can create dead roster spots if you guess wrong too early. McCarthy, meanwhile, lowers the fantasy certainty around the whole offense until the role is settled. Sometimes uncertainty creates a buying opportunity, sometimes it just creates uncertainty. One of the biggest second-order themes this year is how schedule context pushes entire offenses up or down. Chicago went from the league's easiest schedule last season to the 6th hardest now. That matters for wins, but it also matters for fantasy efficiency, especially if the defense was leaning on turnover-driven results that are hard to repeat against better competition. A tougher slate can force more passing volume, which sounds good, but harder opponents also lower drive success and scoring efficiency. More dropbacks are not automatically better if the quality of those dropbacks declines. Detroit gets the reverse effect. Easier opponents create more sustainable offense, more touchdown opportunities, and fewer situations where you need low-probability heroics. That's why Lions projections feel more robust than Bears projections, even when individual player talent debates stay open. Alvin Kamara staying in New Orleans after the contract rework surprised people who expected a trade, but fantasy relevance depends less on the headline and more on what the move implies about usage. Right now, the expectation is a near 50-50 timeshare, and that is the key piece. Familiarity with the Saints system helps preserve a role, but shared backfields usually compress weekly floor unless the passing work is overwhelming or the touchdown role is dominant. So the contract tells us he's staying. It does not, by itself, tell us he is staying in an elite fantasy workload. The cleanest edge right now is probably team environment in Detroit, while Chicago and Minnesota require more tolerance for uncertainty than the market sometimes admits. That's it for Podkey Fantasy Football. This episode was generated by Podkey. Create your own at podkey.fm. Podkey.